Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video.
This interview is brought to you by Pacific Atrocities Education and our upcoming conference in September. Go to www.pacificatrocities.com to reserve your tickets for free today.
Hi, my name is Matsumoto. I am an incoming PhD student at UCLA, currently an associate historian at Pacific Atrocities Education, and also a former intern and fellow at PAE as well.
What inspired you? Introduce your book of Echoes of Empire, The Power of Japanese Propaganda to our audience here with Pacific Atrocities.
Yes, so Echoes of Empire is a book I wrote during my fellowship at Pacific Atrocities Education, and it's focused on kind of a broad thematic overview of Japanese propaganda during the imperial period. So from the Meiji Restoration all the way to the end of World War II. I think some unique aspects of it is how, one, it's thematic, it's not chronological. So I look at four key themes of Imperial Japanese propaganda, which I thought were important and kind of connected. So the first one I call glorification, which is primarily focused on aspects of militarism and colonial expansion, as well as some aspects of sensationalism in the home front. The second aspect, or second chapter, is called Youth, and is focused on education, kind of more propaganda mediums that is focused on younger audiences. And the third chapter is on misogyny and social expectations, where I focus more on gender aspects, primarily expectations for women, primarily adult women in the kind of domestic front. And the last chapter is on race war, which I think is a more popular aspect of Japanese propaganda. It's kind of emphasized in historical scholarship. So I just kind of include it as well.
Those are some pretty heavy topics to have to cover within your work. So with that, your book does play a heavy focus on the imperial era of Japan, which ranged between 1868 to 1945. How did the rise of technologies like newspapers, radios, and film shape the spread of these propagandas during this period?
During the Meiji period, primarily during the First Sino-Japanese War, propaganda was kind of limited to one, newspapers. Of course, that was a really important medium of propaganda because, in part because Japan had a pretty high literacy rate, and two, because there weren't photographic technologies quite available yet. So what that meant was propaganda was quite limited to one, newspapers, and also other artistic forms of medium. Primarily, one that I focus on in the book is nishikie, which is a kind of woodblock print, which is really popular in Japan at the time, in terms of just in popular culture, not just in terms of propaganda. But it became a really popular form of propaganda because it was a good way to sensationalize what was happening during the war. So these really pretty colors, these depictions of Japanese modern soldiers basically destroying the Chinese, that became a really popular medium. This changed quite a bit during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 05, when photography became a more popular and accessible medium. So before, of course, photography existed, but you couldn't really use it in the war front because it couldn't really capture chaotic images, or kind of it wasn't very portable either. So once it became portable, a lot of people used it to depict the military in a more accurate light, so to speak. So it kind of changed from this more artistic, sensationalized view to a different form that was more real to some degree, if that makes sense.
That does. That does. So, within this propaganda, though, what form did the government and military differ from, like, unofficial propaganda that was created more by the civilians or private companies? Were there, like, surprising examples of unofficial propaganda that stood out when you were researching?
Yes, there's quite a few that really stood out. I guess one thing I would emphasize first is that, and this is one of the things I argue in the book, um, Japanese propaganda during this period is really not centralized, if that makes sense. So it
That
really
does.
isn't that top down. Um, well, I mean, to some degree it is, but it isn't really top down in the sense that there's this one propaganda organ or department or administration that is kind of pushing a narrative um, throughout Japan. Um, some historians kind of compare it to what happened in Nazi Germany. It wasn't quite straightforward in that way. There wasn't one single concentrated administration who had power over what was being presented in propaganda. Um, and one of the biggest examples is that the civilian government in the Japanese state was split or kind of divided uh, or distinct from the military in the sense that they both had power, but neither could control the other. It was kind of like the emperor who could control both. But of course, he didn't really do anything in that sense. And since those two organs were separated, they couldn't really create one unified narrative of Japanese uh, imperialism or propaganda. So a lot of times it was kind of competing for power. Um,
Oh.
and what kind of happened in turn, I suppose, uh, was that civilians kind of took up, so civilians, as in like citizens, took up the role of creating propaganda as well.
So it was more of,
And
like, the civilian cultural push that was putting the propaganda out instead of just a singular military unit. That's
yeah,
interesting.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And one of the biggest or one of the most interesting mediums that I guess I will point out is kamishibai. Kamishibai is paper plays which existed before the Meiji Restoration, but it wasn't really used as a form of propaganda, especially military propaganda, until like World War II, the Pacific War.
Oh, that's an
Um,
interesting transition.
mhm. And I thought it was also interesting because the medium exists today. Um, it's kind of originally and today as well meant to be just a form of street entertainment for children, where usually like an older man on a bike brings his paper plays to like a park or something, and then children, what the Japanese government used, but also other citizens and citizen organizations use to propagate very much kind of pro-military, self-sacrifice ideology and very pro-emperor ideology onto children. Because it's a medium that's focused on children. So I thought that was one I thought was really interesting. And these things are very local, of course, because um, they're focused on local children and neighborhoods. So in that way, it was kind of something that was very much led by citizens, regular citizens, as opposed to something superimposed by the government or the military, which I thought was really interesting.
That's extremely interesting because that in a relation to other countries, you see it within Americanized, like the cartoons from back in the day when they would try to get people to join the military. So that's interesting that it happened through the paper plays.
Mhm.
You've written about Japanese propaganda in animation. How
Mhm.
did visual media, like animation, contribute to the propaganda efforts that you've been studying?
I guess visual media is one kind of through line, I guess you can really see within what's happening during Imperial Japan. So, of course, during the Meiji period, it was very much kind of this artwork like woodblock prints, which really sensationalized the war effort. And you can really see how this visual aspect is also continued throughout the Pacific War as well, whether if it's in terms of paper plays or very much so, as you mentioned, these cartoons. Um, and it shows how uh, modernization really amplified this visual aspect. So not only did it make it easier to create them and distribute them throughout Japan, but also it really added new layers to how you can visualize um, the war and really sensationalize the war. And I think one thing, especially in terms of cartoons, um, which I think became very clear, was that um, a lot of the visual medium started to become inclusive of children and the youth. So um, I guess initially in terms of woodblock prints, of course, children might really like them and find them sensational as well. It wasn't really geared towards them, so to speak. But as uh, kind of these technologies became better and better, it became a very inclusive form of propaganda where not only adults can really enjoy them, but also children, and also even women as well. And just everyone in Japan can really take advantage of it to a certain degree, which is of course very scary to think about how inclusive this kind of propaganda can be, because in part it becomes very difficult to see how it's a form of propaganda, how it's a medium that's really propagating very dangerous ideas, because of course the cartoons look so innocent and kind of humorous and joyful. Yeah, you can really see how this very inclusive medium becomes a really easy way to normalize violence.
All right, so within your book, you also notate the societal and individual impacts of this propaganda. Can you elaborate on any specific examples of how propaganda influenced Japanese society or individual behavior during the imperial era?
It's one I would emphasize is um, expectations of gender, I suppose. And I think this is really interesting because the transition, from what I can tell, is very drastic and very fast. So during the 1920s, during the Taisho period, there was quite a boom in terms of Western popular culture in Japan, whether if it's like fashion or even ideology, political ideology as well. Um, and expectations of gender, especially towards Japanese women, uh, changed quite a bit. Where like Western fashion and Western cultures became much more popular, primarily in urban regions, of course. And then this changed quite a bit during the late 1930s and the early 40s, where all of a sudden gender expectations became very traditional, like very Neo-Confucian, where women, especially mothers and wives, were expected to stay in the household, um, be a form of self-sacrifice for the men on the battlefield. And they're very chaste in the sense that they wear very traditional clothing. You emphasize how uh, it's expected to take care of children first and foremost. And kind of the culture that existed during the Taisho period was kind of flipped on its head. Their sole responsibility became um, to sacrifice themselves for the betterment of one, the family, and to the country as a whole. So I guess that's one way where there's a very significant shift, one in society, but also for the individuals as well, because these are things that um, these mothers and wives really internalized themselves. It wasn't something that was purely imposed on them. It was something that they kind of accepted, um, in part because of all the propaganda that was kind of spreading during this period.
Okay, so within the book, you draw a lot of parallels. especially between propaganda of Imperial Japan and modern disinformation. What lessons from your research that you were doing do you think are most relevant for understanding today's media landscape?
I think on a very broad level, what I would emphasize is that propaganda, especially as a concept, has become very derogatory. Of course, it's an oppressive structure, but one thing that I think people avoid is to really think about what propaganda is very seriously. I mean, when you hear the word propaganda or hear that something is propaganda, it's very dismissive, right? You kind of are using it to either downplay something or to just basically dismiss certain mediums and information. And I think what's really important here is to understand what propaganda really is and how it operates. I guess using Imperial Japan, for instance, as a form of case study, I suppose, to see how it operates today. And of course, the way that propaganda is spread and structured today is pretty different in terms of the mediums that people use. But I think there's certain parallels that you see in terms of how, for instance, one, it's something that people really internalize as opposed to something that really imposed by states. It's something that kind of comes out of more grassroots areas and culture, so to speak. And for instance, one example that I kind of bring up in the conclusion, although this is more on a political scale, is how the recent rise in Japanese far right ideology has kind of fueled these far right political parties. And they use very similar language of kind of nationalism, pro emperor ideology, and then also aspects of gender and race as well. It really means that these ideas haven't really gone away after the end of the war. It's really persisted, not just among these like far right extremist individuals, but also among regular Japanese people as well, which is why in the most recent election, I think a lot of people voted for those parties compared to other years. So in that way, it's really important to see how what was happening during the imperial era, which might feel like a long time ago, still really exists today, whether if it's in terms of kind of content of the propaganda or in terms of kind of structures of how it operates as well.
Your background as a Japanese national and Korean descendant, how did that help or kind of influence your research? Did it change any understandings that you had prior going into it? Did it like influence you in one way versus the other?
Um, I guess in a certain way, it motivated me to do the research. I don't know how much it really influenced kind of my analysis and the things I found throughout the research, but of course, it really motivated me. It's because, I mean, as someone who's Japanese, of course, I am a quarter Korean, but it's not something that I really knew until later on. Um, but as someone who is Japanese, I feel a certain responsibility to do this kind of research because even though I was born over 50 years after the war, um, it is a legacy that is really relevant to every Japanese person, every Japanese citizen. Um, and these ideas or these feelings of responsibility and guilt really fueled this kind of research and seeing how um, these aspects of propaganda uh, really created or led to the violence that was being ensued on the battlefront and also in Japanese colonies as well. And I guess one aspect that reflecting on now that I really regret not focusing on is like colonial propaganda. And what I mean by that is how, um, in the book, it's really focused on aspects of war. So primarily uh, wars in China, some aspects of Russia, and a lot of it in the Asia Pacific War. But I didn't quite touch upon the propaganda organs that was operating in colonial Korea, colonial Taiwan, Okinawa, Hokkaido, and so on. So I guess that's something I guess would be a really important next step to doing this kind of research, is to see how colonies, one of course had structures of propaganda as well, but two, how these earlier aspects of imperialist propaganda for Japan became really important during the Asia Pacific War, because a lot of the colonial structures in these regions were used not just solely in terms of propaganda, but in terms of policy and expansion, were used during the Asia Pacific War in regions like Southeast Asia and Manchuria as well. So that's something I guess it's kind of a next step, especially because I am a quarter Korean, and that also is an aspect that really motivates my thinking as well. So
Well, it sounds like you have much more research on your hands in the future and possibly another project on your hands. What was the most challenging aspect then of researching and writing about such a complex and very sensitive topic? Were there any discoveries that you came across that surprised you?
to answer the first question, uh, it's very difficult to kind of do all this research, especially in a relatively short amount of time, because I mean the topic is quite broad. When it comes to propaganda during Imperial Japan, and there's just so many different aspects of Japanese propaganda that I could have touched, and kind of finalizing what to pick and choose, and also how to structure the book was definitely the hardest part. And as I said, I of course it's missing some aspects. Not to kind of downplay the book, but yeah, to really organize it, and kind of choose what aspects of propaganda to focus on was definitely the biggest challenge, because there is just so much information on this available, whether it's in the archives or in secondary source research as well. I guess there were quite a few things that really surprised me. Um, I suppose. I guess one that kind of stood out um, was during the Pacific War. There was this very strong um, emphasis of sexualizing like Western women, and what I mean by that is that kind of one of a very strong narrative that was being pushed, especially the later years of the Pacific War, was that when Japanese women are, you know, kind of feminine in a very Neo-Confucian expectation. So they're chaste, uh, they have this aspect of motherhood to them. And that narrative was really being pushed in the domestic front, so in the homeland. But then when it comes to the war front, so in the Philippines, for instance, Japanese army and Japanese navy were like spreading these leaflets that are depicting Western women, primarily American women, as kind of base, so to speak. So they're kind of depicting them as like they're cheating on the American soldiers who are in the war, as a way to kind of demoralize the Americans fighting the war. Of course, it didn't quite work that much, according to them, but I think the way they really depicted them as really sexualized, uh, and really sexist kind of depiction is kind of really shocking, especially in contrast to how propaganda, like gendered propaganda, was being pushed in the home front. This kind of juxtaposition was really interesting.
For viewers who are inspired by your book, what is one key takeaway that you hope they gain about the power of propaganda, either historically or in our modern time?
Oh boy, there's quite a few things, I guess I could say. I guess two things I would really emphasize is that one, propaganda isn't necessarily top down. It's not centralized. It is also very much a bottom up structure as well. Um, it's something that people internalize. Um, it's something that regular people, so to speak, propagate as well. It's not something that is purely done by the state. It's really something that is very much operates within kind of the collective body of the people within a certain group or a certain country, a certain race, and so on. And the second thing I think is really important that hopefully the book illustrates is how uh, propaganda is very much intersectional. And what I mean by that is, although I don't use this language specifically in the book, it is not purely militaristic. It's not purely race. It's not purely about class. It's not purely about gender. It's very much a mix of these things. And that's something I really tried to illustrate in the book. Even though I divide these aspects, these themes, I tried to really talk about how uh, they're very much kind of they very much intersect in various aspects or various mediums of propaganda. Um, I think is really important to see that, especially because the racial aspect is very much something that has been emphasized a lot, especially during the kind of the late um, 80s, 90s, and so on, when this research was being produced. Then you also kind of have to see how that operates within different aspects and different themes as well.
Do you have any future projects that you're planning right now, working on, that you would like to hint at or talk about at all before we go?
Well, there's quite a few different projects. During the fellowship, what I did was I interviewed a couple from Japan who did who still does work on kind of advocating for remembering Japanese atrocities. And they're kind of a theater group called Imagine 21, where they produce plays and perform them themselves on various aspects of Japanese atrocities, whether if it's um, colonialism, Manchuria, the Nanjing massacre, or the Kafur issue. But their work has been very much um, a strong motivation for my own work. And they will be performing in the conference as well.
Oh, okay.
And I'm still um, uh, kind of transitioning now to seeing how I can really use their artistic work as a kind of as kind of subject of analysis for my own research as well. So
Oh, that's interesting. All right, so we've talked about the conference a few times. So, where can everyone find you September 18th, 2025?
they'll be able to find me at the conference in San Francisco. So hopefully everyone will be able to join or at least check it out. Um, and I really look forward to presenting and also promoting my work as well.
Understandable. I'm very excited to meet you at the conference. I know I will be there, and I have a feeling quite a few people are going to come out and meet you, and we're all going to have a good time. Um, Thank you so much for sitting down and taking the time with me today.